Thank you, Barbara. Is this on? You hear me? Okay. Thank you. So how many of you came to this session worried when you saw the title that I was going to spend 2 hours and 45 minutes reviewing Carnegie data and statistics? Yeah. Well, it's a legitimate worry because I usually spend Friday mornings in a doctoral seminar doing just that. The good news is my roots are in experiential education, so we'll probably only do about 2 hours and 10 minutes. And as is typical at conferences, allow 5 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Okay, seriously, I will go through a lot of data. You don't need to take notes. There won't be a quiz on it. And the slides will be on, what is it, the conference website? Whose website? Somebody's. Okay. Anyway, so they'll be available because they are dense. They probably violate the rule of 6 words per line and 6 lines per slide. But anyway, I want to give an overview, and then after about 45 minutes or so of that, our 2 provosts will talk about reacting to what I've said, their experience, and just a conversation on all of this. Then we'll take a break, and then we have an exercise at table groups for you to work on, and then some reporting out. And then this afternoon, for those of you who are interested, I'll be over in the Tourmay room, but I won't be singing, which is across from Armstrong 2, and focusing on what are the lessons learned from the 2010 classification. And if you're thinking, and I'll show who needs to apply in 2015 and reapply, if you're thinking that that's something you're going to be involved in, I have some sort of advance information, what the changes may be in 2015. So that'll be more like a working session, probably, Barbara, like the sessions we did before 2010 that MAC and Campus Compact and NERCI did, preparing people for the application process. And then, so after the table groups report in around a discussion of what they think some of the challenges are that they are facing, then we'll have a wrap up and break for lunch. Any comments or questions on that? Okay. Yeah, I want to say a word about NERCI. It's been around for about 20 years, I guess, and it was really founded at UMass Boston by Zelda Gamson. Those of us who use the best practices, I see some nods, best practices in undergraduate education that Z and Art Chickering put out a number of years ago. I still have a stack of them in my office and use them in my curriculum class and with my students. But the idea was that many universities have research centers, but often the research doesn't get translated into practice. So the idea of NERCI is that it's a resource center that does research, it does practice, and it links those together. And a lot of the knowledge comes from practitioners, so it's not an abstract research. So I'm really honored to be there. And I want to mention my colleague, John Saltmarsh, who's also a faculty member in the Higher Ed Administration program. Some of you probably know John from some years ago directing the Engaged Campus Institute at National Campus Compact. And since 2005, he's been the director of NERCI. And after the 2008 classification, some personnel changes at the Carnegie Foundation, the question was, so how will the classification proceed? So NERCI has partnered with Carnegie, and NERCI is the administrative partner for the classification, and we're also the research partner. So we have a huge data set that if we had a couple $100,000, we could spend the next 5 years analyzing everything on the Carnegie data set. So what I'm going to present this morning are some data that John and some other people have pulled together around the question of what do we know about engaged scholarship by looking at some of the Carnegie classification data. How many of you are are at Carnegie classified institutions? Okay. How many of those? 2006. Okay, so there's some of the pioneers. 2008. Okay. And 2010. Okay, you had to answer questions that some of the other people didn't, right? The bar keeps moving up. Okay, thank you. So what I want to do is provide, let me get my laser here. I want to provide bits of 2 studies and also give you references where we've published some of these other data if you're interested. But essentially, we did a study starting with the 2006 data. We started it in 2008, and we're in year 4 of a 2-year project. So we have published the first 2 phases. Phase 3 will be revealing the results next week at the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, and also 2 weeks after that at the Association for the Study of Higher Ed, ASH. So I will just touch on those today, and the study will be available in a couple weeks. And then the other study is the Stewards of Place study. We're calling it, everything has to have an acronym. So this is SOP, which does not stand for, it does not stand for the usual SOP, but Stewards of Place 2. And I'll give more on the rationale, but it's a joint project with NERCI and with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, better known as ASCU. I was going to ask this later. Let me ask you, how many of you are on ASCU campuses? Ah, okay. Oh, this will be fascinating then. Okay, so these are the 2 studies that I'll report on in a little bit of detail and give you references to some of the other studies. Figure out which hand to use for what here. Just to acknowledge, this is the research team that's been working since early 2008 on the faculty rewards study, and it's John and myself and a group of our either current or former graduate students in the doctoral program in higher education administration. In 2004, a group of us got together and said, how can we support the next generation of engaged scholars? So we formed ourselves as kind of a loose scholarship of engagement working group. Carrie Ann O'Mara, who's next door, is one of those people. So we've been doing a number of studies and trying to make sense of the data, and very much from a practical standpoint, what do we learn from this that will help us support engaged scholarship? This is, some of you have seen this. Probably half the hands went up on the Carnegie classification. So this is the definition. I'm just getting the right button here. And we're going to come back and unpack some of these, especially those that have been particularly challenging. But mutually beneficial is easy to say. Some of my students were saying the other night, it's a lot easier to say than reciprocity. Because once you get tripped up on reciprocity, it's one of those things you can never say it right again. But that's one of the challenges. And some would say, well, exchange may not be a strong enough word, but we'll come back to that. And then in a context then of partnership and reciprocity. So that's the Carnegie definition, and part of what we'll be doing is unpacking that. I think this is live. Oh, let me see. I'm not sure I have internet here. Just those of you who haven't had a chance to look, there's what the website looks like. It's truncating over there, but essentially you'll see the lists of the different years, the documentation framework, and all the statistics, and I'll give you some of the statistics. But that link is in this PowerPoint. So, since part of what we do, what John and I do, is we have appointments that insist, speaking of scholarship, that we do a certain amount of research every year, as many faculty do. So as we looked at the Carnegie from both our practitioner lenses and research lenses, we said, what a rich database to test some assumptions that are either implicit or explicit in the Carnegie process. And one is that you can have an external lever, one with some prestige in our work, for change. And that it's not just a little bit of change, it needs to be institutional transformation, or as a lot of the discussion yesterday and last evening was about serious cultural change. And if you really have engaged, community-engaged institutions that engagement will be reflected in multiple pathways in multiple dimensions. So from these two propositions, to use formal research language, we've devised a number of research questions and ways of looking at the data. Okay, we get a lot of the questions are just sort of basic, how many, and I hear everything from, well, everybody that applied kind of got it. You don't really have to work too hard because it seems like everybody knows somebody who skated fast on a certain section of the application, maybe even their own institution, and we're surprised to get it. I also have heard doing workshops around the country on how do you get ready. So, there's no way we could do this. This is impossible. And neither of those is true. The truth somewhere in the middle. Here are the data across the 3 years, and I'll come back and look at this first one in a minute with a handout. Those of you who've done this know there's really a prior step. You apply to apply or a letter of intent, and then some number actually apply, and then some smaller number actually receive the designation. And I think the point here, not to count these, but it really is across all of the types of higher education institutions that are classified in the other Carnegie mandatory classification. Let me pass this out. This is just the these are the overview statistics on the 2010. Just trying to send them back. Barbara, can I have one? Thanks. And as one of my students said the other night, this is the fascinating study. Why did almost half withdraw after signaling intent? And anecdotally, we know a lot of reasons. The provost said we weren't ready, or we changed provosts, or we started looking at the application and we just said, no, this is going to take us 5 years to get ready. And one campus that I thought that they could probably do this like overnight, and when they said, no, we have to do this, and this. So some of it may have been just maybe over-worrying or really just striving for excellence. So essentially, if you look at the 115, 305, you get about a 38% success rate on that. So the Carnegie classification is very broad, and I'm going to go through the 4 areas, but what I want to focus on today and what I've been asked to focus on, and what's the focus of this, is what about engaged scholarship? Yesterday and this morning, there's the Faculty Rewards Institute going on over there, focusing on really the faculty dimension of this work. But since the title this morning is the context, I want to look a little bit at some of the other context of the full classification to see where it fits. There are a number of definitions out there, and we will not do an exercise in going through all 10 or 15 definitions. I actually wrote an article on that once. Laura Lee Sandman has written about it, because in any kind of emerging or innovative practice, there's always the question of names. And in higher ed, there's the pressure that each campus seems to want to name it in their own context. If they have land-grant traditions, those names are one thing. If they're liberal arts, those are another. If they're professional schools, that name may be another. But I'll use the term usually engaged scholarship. I personally, because my background and my degrees in community development, so I like to use the word community engaged scholarship. Yesterday, Carrie Ann, I think, was using publicly engaged scholarship. And so I think for now, absent a long parsing of all the definitions, to use this term. But this is I find this to be a helpful book in that it gives examples, it gives a framework, and it focuses on what kinds of knowledge are needed for solving complex problems, and also the idea that engaged scholarship, sometimes I hear, well, this engaged scholarship is really nice, and it's kind of altruistic, and we really ought to work with our community partners, but I'm not sure that's our mission. I had a chancellor tell me one time that the mission of our university had nothing to do with that community, that all the constituencies of that university were national, international, alums, parents of undergrad students, etc. But I think that this is the shift in thinking about engaged scholarship, is that it is about our core work in the academy, regardless of if we're a Research 1 or any other classification. We are in, to paraphrase Peter Drucker, we're in the knowledge business. So how we create, how we share, and how we apply that knowledge is critical. And so this is a reference by Andrew Van de Ven on what engaged scholarship is. Please, I don't want to keep saying any questions, any comments. Please just jump in for questions, comments, arguments, clarifications, elaborations, experiences, okay? That'll keep me from going into too much of an overview of data. One of the evolutions in higher education in the last, what year is this, 2011? In the last 21 years since Ernest Boyer wrote Scholarship Reconsidered, and talked about the 4 kinds of scholarship, and then just before his death in 1996 said he wanted to have the term scholarship of engagement subsume the term application. So this is a slide that John developed for our provost. We got a new provost who decided we needed a new data set for faculty research, and it would be online. We wouldn't have to fill out all these forms. So we had 2 boxes to check of our scholarship every time we listed a piece of scholarship on our annual review. Is this basic or is this applied? So some of us decided to tackle that, and through a series of discussions, we now have 3 boxes that we can check on our faculty form: basic, applied, and engaged. And on this slide, John and I are suggesting that it really is a continuum. And again, this is one of the worries, one of the concerns I hear is this: are we trying to create a new, some hegemony or only one kind of knowledge? And the answer is, well, for a long time the academy, especially since we adopted the German positivist model of higher education in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, so applied comes in, although it's always had its traditions in land grants. So you could look at this historically as well as an inclusive framework of what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of scholarship count. So anyway, we haven't yet figured out all the subtleties across these. There are people have implicit hierarchies. Yes?
In your 3-box system, are you allowed to check more than 1 box for a piece of scholarship?
I haven't done my annual report yet this year. But initially it was exclusive, and we were arguing, that you could check multiple boxes, but, programmers don't like multiple boxes, or at least they. But that's a good question. I'll look into that because that's also part of the hierarchy is exclusivity. It's either one or the other, and so we were told that it would end up that way. But I'm not sure we actually checked. I think we have to do another overlay. But we have a new provost, so we have some new software now, and we have a much more. That wasn't fair, right? But actually, as I say, I'm a little behind on doing my annual report for last year, but the new software is much more interactive and much more user-friendly, and I understand that you can use multiple classifications. Yeah?
So is this continuum, is that for every single discipline at the university?
Yes. Well, some disciplines are more one than the other. It's really that across all disciplines there are options. And Some disciplines would say they're mostly applied or seen as mostly applied, but there may be basic research. And it's opened up a wonderful discussion precisely on that question. So is this scholarship that John and I are doing here, where does this fit on our own taxonomy? Is it a basic understanding of an institution that, social sciences would say that's basic research? Is it applied because we're out on the road and, talking with people, designing programs to apply it? And because it's about engagement, although is it really engaged in the way that some of the definitions of working with community partners? That one's a little gray, at least in my case, at the moment. Did you want to pursue a particular discipline, or?
No, I just was curious as to how
Yeah.
you're able to get your faculty in particular different areas to buy into that.
Yeah.
Some of our areas, it's a natural fit, and they included in scholarship as part of PhD. I'm not faculty, I'm administrator where I am, but then there's some areas where I can't imagine it ever being. Some of my colleagues are here from my university, and they can agree or disagree. I don't know if there's some areas that really embrace this ever.
You mean checking at least one of the boxes?
What are you considering, engaged scholarship as part of it?
Oh, so this is the box that would be problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sure. Really?
I don't see it that way. I'm in the Center for Education at Widener. And,
Yeah, okay.
But I am the director of the Science Teaching Center, so I live in the science building.
Mm-hmm.
And arts and sciences, even though when we first started, were not as apt to understand how they might become engaged. I think over the last 5 years or 8 years, you're seeing more of that spattered across campus. But not, obviously not everywhere.
Actually, there's kind of an epistemological debate behind this. Could something be engaged? In other words, is this a cumulative or a nested classification? So your question about engaged coming at the end, but for instance, I have a colleague in earth sciences. He and his students are testing backyard gardens in the south side and lower west side of Boston to look for concentrations of heavy metals, including some of the community garden projects that probably service learning classes at other universities our own set up. So, all right, so he has basic science of surprising the amount of heavy metals in the soil in people's vegetable gardens in certain neighborhoods. And then, is it applied? Well, yes, they're working on some amelioration. They're working with community groups to get this knowledge out and to think about what ameliorates it. And it's engaged because students are doing it and doing it with community people, and the forms of dissemination are related to this. So the basic would be studying the contaminants and never asking the question, who should know this, besides the peer-reviewed journal in which I publish, or my colleagues at a scientific conference. Or you could go the next step of a couple of experiments. Let's apply, I come from the land-grant tradition, so I'm used to all these little plots with the stakes and the flags. And yeah, anybody? Not much of that in land-grants anymore. It's all biotech, right? But anyway, so, you could look at different plots and you could try to ameliorate plot A, plot B in different neighborhoods. And you could say, we have applied the findings of heavy metal concentrations and we now know, pun intended, what to apply to the soil to ameliorate that. But that's not engaged until people become more than research subjects. They become engaged in the process and defining and ameliorating, and also community solutions. Particularly, what if a community has worked hard to have a community garden, which is a good thing? At least I think most of us think that, and then they discover something like that. So that may be a long example, long answer, but I think that's a good example because it starts out in basic science, which most of our sciences at UMass Boston are integrated. So this would be some chemistry, some geology. Yeah? Oh. Okay. All right. So very quickly, in this study, in phase 1, we reviewed 57 applications from 2006. And in phase 2, around the question of promotion and tenure, we did what some of us delicately called a veracity analysis, where people said in their application, oh yes, engaged scholarship counts for promotion and tenure on our campus. We actually went in and read, I see some wise smiles back there. We actually went in and read, and this is really exciting reading. We read, of the 57, 33 said yes to the optional question, and we read and studied all 33 sets of promotion and tenure guidelines, except for one school who told us theirs were secret and they weren't on the web, and we couldn't have them. So it was actually 32. And we've published those results. This is the data on the 2006. I think well, here, let me go there. So when I get into 2010, I'll talk about the changes about the dual classification, which is no longer available. But these are the questions that were asked on the optional questions that were asked in 2006. Essentially, does this count? Does scholarship, is it rewarded? And if so, how does it categorize it? And this was one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's one of the areas where, as a set of institutions, all 260-some Carnegie institutions, if you look across the data and make some fallacious assumptions about longitudinal research, etc., one of the things that we're seeing, and we haven't really done trend data because the changes in the application, it's not set up for research, it's set up for practice. So we're trying to, always the questions of dealing with data that weren't designed necessarily for research, although they are. But they say, yes, oh yes, engaged scholarship counts on our campus. And then when we'd look at what the application said, oh, well, yeah, it counts in service, But especially in the 2006 data, we found very few where it counts in scholarship. Occasionally in teaching, if it's a service learning course, say, well, we'll bump it up from service to teaching, but probably not scholarship, even if there were scholarly products produced out of that teaching product. And that gets into some other issues that have recently come out of Carnegie about what progress we've made in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So then we asked the question. Then the question was asked on the Carnegie application: if no, are you working on this? And a number of campuses said yes. Some of which we were able to find evidence of the work. Others the intentions were probably not as public, or there may have been committees that weren't publicly known. So anyway. So we had an early snapshot, and this was the research question, and we decided we needed some kind of a theoretical framework, and we wanted to look at some of the models that talked about transformational change, and I'll go over this quickly. Probably a number of you, this has been around for a while, the Eckel, Hill, and Green, and all the various iterations of the ACE study. But this is the model. There are really two dimensions of change. One is depth, and the other is breadth, or pervasiveness. And so we hypothesized for our study that the Carnegie classification, Carnegie classified institutions, the 33 who'd answered the question yes, that promotion and tenure count, would be in this quadrant, that it would be deep and it would be pervasive. And what we found by applying this, that of the 33, only this definition of transformational change, yesterday in the Faculty Rewards Institute, a lot of talk about culture and affects the whole institution. Of course, intentional promotion and tenure guidelines and reward systems don't just evolve. They're deep, they're rooted, they're cultural, and they're contentious in many cases. So anyway, so we published these data, and some of you are familiar with the Josie Bass New Directions in Higher Education, and so we published those findings in there. We've published them a couple other places too. But so anyway, we then identified, based on the transformational model of Eckel, Hill, and Green, we identified 7 exemplar campuses that had changed promotion and tenure guidelines. So we then did phase 3 of the study, which is what we're just writing up right now. And we interviewed the chief academic officer, and I'm delighted that we have 2 CAOs here to react to this, and then the person whose role it was to provide leadership for community engagement. In many cases, it was the former CAO. In fact, if you look, and one of the challenges of this study is the data set that was assembled for this whole book on the first wave of Carnegie was assembled. First of all, the first wave, those of you who may remember, was hard copy. It was not electronic. So we then had to get the copies of the application, get permission, and agree to the standard forms of anonymity and confidentiality. So when we got to phase 3, I personally interviewed on 3 of the campuses of the 7, and the provost said, "Please, we're proud of what we're doing. You'll mention our names, right?" And we said, "No, by our IRB guidelines, we can't mention your names." So anyway, so we've worked to disguise these. Those of you who study this might be able to figure out some, just like I remember as an undergraduate sociology major, one of the challenges was to figure out where all these community studies were with all these funny names. So these are basically the findings, and some of which we expected and some of which we didn't. And I'm not sure you have all of these, so we can put this slide back up when you... Interestingly enough, on one of the campuses that had changed its promotion and tenure guidelines over 10 years ago, found out that the president had come up through the ranks as dean, associate provost, and president. And coming up through the ranks had carried this personal commitment, which is here, and also understood the challenges and the barriers. But one of the kind of standard questions you ask when you study change is, well, is it top-down or is it bottom-up? Which is usually an oversimplification. But that's one of the things that we were interested in. So I should say something about these 7 institutions. There's actually a backstory to the 2006 classification, and that is in 2005, there were 14 pilot institutions that actually helped to create, they both served as pilot studies for the data, and they helped to create the classification. And actually, a number of those institutions are in the 2006 data, and some of them are probably overrepresented here. But we were asking our questions about, well, so was this a lever for change? And how did you change your promotion and tenure guidelines? And one provost said, no, the Carnegie classification is a yawn. So that was a great opportunity to probe for meaning. And essentially, no, we're already there. We know who we are. We know we're an engaged campus. We know what counts, and we know how we're moving forward. And this is an affirmation, but in terms of changing things, not so much. A personal commitment of leaders. This is tied to this first finding. And faculty and administrative alignment. Those of us who've ever sat on a promotion, tenure, reward, retention committee know that there's this sense that this is the work of the faculty. And if those of us who've been in positions where we weren't faculty were saying, oh, we're not allowed there. And even though most campuses have a series of levels, dean's level, provost level, often those are at odds. And of course, the interesting tenure cases that make the tenure promotion cases that make the Chronicle of Higher Ed are usually the ones where there's some disconnect amongst one or more levels of the review. But in one case, there was a president who brought to the campus the commitment to do this. At the same time, there were faculty committees asking the questions about curriculum. So as they worked through that changed mission, then the question came, well, where are faculty in all of this? So the first issues were, the first changes were led by the president and the cabinet. but the second came up from the faculty. So it was both and alignment. And that was interesting because the literature on change in higher education is mixed on the question of, how much does the administration and academic leadership influence change, and to what extent is this the province of the faculty, which is a deeply held belief in higher education. We also asked some questions, not only, and I should say, one of the limits of this study is we have no clue how the policy changes are working, if they make a difference. We do have clues, but we didn't study it. But we were asking some questions about how it was being implemented. And we're using the term intellectual leader, and one provost said it has to be somebody on campus who has legitimacy in both camps. The camp of traditional scholarship, coming back to, and the camp of engaged scholarship. And those people are hard to find on many campuses, and also then to have the ability to lead in almost every case, someone who's fairly senior. So that was one of the findings. And any deans in the room? Okay, good, we can talk. One of the surprising findings for us is that we knew the department chairs had an influence, and we knew the department faculty personnel committees had an influence. But what we missed somehow, and we're surprised by the data, is on how many campuses, especially larger campuses, the role of the dean in actually implementing promotion and tenure guidelines, as well as prior to that, working with the faculty committee. And on many campuses, the provost would say, well, what do the change guidelines look like? And the provost would say, well, you really need to interview all 9 deans on our campus, at which point, since we were working on a budget of about 87 cents for research, we said, no, we're not going to do that. So that's a limit, because in all 7 of the institutions, the role of the dean in changing promotion and tenure and actually implementing. It's one thing to change a policy, but it's another and to implement. And one of the authors, she's going to be the first author, Elaine Ward, on the paper next week, has developed a diagram on the tightrope of scholarship. And so the engaged scholar walks the tightrope between her department and what she's staked out as engaged scholar. The department walks that tightrope, and in some ways it was interesting that the dean that put the safety net under the tightrope on the college level, and then then given that on a lot of these large, somewhat decentralized campuses, so if the deans are approving cases, an engaged scholarship, under new guidelines, so then what happens, what does the tightrope look like between the 9 deans and the provost's office? And as you know, there'll be variance across it. So these are basically the findings on that 2006. So before I shift to the next study, let me just see if there are any questions, comments. Okay. Yeah, sure.
So if you're trying to understand an institution's position on scholarship or on rewarding promotion to faculties who are doing scholarship, don't you have to go way beyond what the institution's policies are? Wouldn't you want to go through like individual faculty dossiers?
Yes.
And institutions do that, and can you get that information?
Yeah. Thank you. Excellent question. Did you all hear that? Okay. At Michigan State University, there's an organization called they've changed their name now. It used to be the National Center. Now it's called the National Collaborative for the Study Community University. Anyway, it's a national collaboration to study these questions. And Diane Doberneck, who's a research associate, has spent the last 3 years doing exactly what you suggest, and some of her work is published. SUE, National Center for the Study of University Engagement. Okay, the C is for center, not community. So anyway, on their website, what Sharon has assembled are all just for Michigan State faculty. I don't know how she and I have had some conversations how we could follow up this study with that kind of in-depth work nationally, and we've sort of just said we don't know how to do that. But anyway, of several hundreds of faculty who, by certain definitions, are considered engaged scholars. She has all their promotion and tenure records. She has all their grant and annual report and productivity records, and also their HR records. And so she's doing that. And it would be not, but that, you're right, that's where it is. Does it make a difference? Do engaged scholars get more grants? Because one of the words on the street is, well, you really can't do this work because, we need grants and we need the overhead. So you really, people don't pay for this. So that's one of the questions, and she's finding some interesting trends that does influence that. And she's actually working with a colleague who's interested in, I think we probably call it, cradle to TIA CREF kind of career paths on this, who's interested in socialization. So how do faculty become engaged scholars? But there is some interesting and good research on that.
But if
Yeah.
you're making the claim
Yeah.
that, for example, our institution rewards faculty promotion because they're doing engaged scholarship, could I only make that claim looking at the policies, or would I, for example, when we apply for the Carnegie classification next time, would I need to have access to all of these faculty dossiers who had gotten promoted and the faculty who hadn't gotten promoted and look at them,
Yeah.
look at what their scholarship was?
Well, of course, this is one of the problems. These data are secret. Proceedings around personnel issues are confidential, as they should be, and that operates against. People were talking yesterday about myths. That operates against the myth of nobody's ever gotten promoted for that on this campus. Ask 10 faculty and 10 administrators and 10 staff people. In each case, you'll get 9 and say, oh, maybe Sharon, she did that project, and Chestnut Hill, and maybe, yeah, I think she did. And then you look, well, it was probably under service. So anyway, that is the problem. And so this is background preliminary, and that's a huge limitation. But for the practical question, somebody in your institution, probably the person in provost's office, who actually looks at dossiers year after year, may or may not keep records, and without naming names, there's somebody who knows that. Whether they'll tell you or whether you can find that person, that is one of the challenges of trying to get data out of a confidential process. I hope maybe you'll say more about that. Okay, thank you. Good question. So this is these are preliminary findings, but we feel that before we can look at the practice, we have to see what sort of the policy foundation is. And in reality, there are, this is one of those questions. Does policy follow practice, or does practice follow policy? In a number of cases, by the time the guidelines were changed, there had been a number of faculty who had actually gone through, slipped through, snuck through, or were in a particular department or college where that was okay. This is just a model. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. I wonder, on the other end of the spectrum, sort of the macro level of this, if you or others have done research on professional associations and the extent to which they might be incentivizing or de-incentivizing engaged scholarship as well, because obviously there are institutional incentives that could be put into place to promote this, but I'm wondering if faculty, in the peer review process, are encouraged or not encouraged by their professional associations or others.
Yeah. There are two parts to that answer. One is, and Gene Rice does a lot of work on this, and you ask Gene and he'll tick off all the different disciplinary associations that have changed ways of knowing, looked at more engaged ways of teaching and learning, and that's the, if you will, that's the half full answer. When we interviewed the provosts, at least several of the provosts in this study, we said, well, part of faculty resistance, if this works here, what does that do to them out on the market? Okay, we all know Wagner and what it does, but what if I want to go to Penn State or someplace like that? Will it count? So part of it may be internalized concern about the disciplinary associations that particularly junior scholars have. And again, it's some of those things we're going to have to look at over time. But so they're, like most change. There are forces for and forces against, and we're not sure where to use Lewin's term, where the force field is. Matt?
Dwight, I have an observation based on the methodology, and not to devalue this study, but I'd be really more interested in the results from 2008 and even 2010. When I think of your original conception,
Right.
basic, applied, engaged scholarship, in 2006, I don't think we could have had a meaningful conversation
No.
about what engaged
No.
scholarship was. And so the answer to that question, does your campus do engaged scholarship, I imagine we're all over the board.
Yeah.
And so
And
while
actually-
we have some valuable results, I would think that the results from 2008 and even 2010 would be that much more important because what we know as engaged scholarship is really crystallized.
Yeah. It's really impossible to make longitudinal comparisons. I mean, first of all, these data are 5 years old that I just went over, but we thought they'd be an important benchmark. Let me take that as a cue and looking at my watch. Let's go to 2008, 2010. This is the documentation framework. These are the questions. Again, this is something we can talk more about this afternoon. You can find on the Carnegie website. What's new in 2010 is you could not, in 2006 and 2008, you would get to here, and then there was a stop, do not pass go, if you couldn't answer all the foundational indicators. And at that point, the faculty question was optional. In 2008, it becomes required, and in 2010, you can't choose either curriculum engagement or outreach and partnerships. So the two separate classifications disappeared, and so that's just the background for the changes across time. So this study, in part because of feasibility, in part because we've been partnering with ASCU, and they had a project in 2002 called Stewards of Place, where they really said, place matters. We're here, place matters. And, some institutions could uproot and move and it wouldn't affect their mission, some higher ed institutions. So anyway, based on that, and also for some methodological reasons, we decided to, I'm going to go through these, we decided to look at the 2008 and the 2010 data, selecting only ASCU schools. And, those of you who teach research methods in social sciences know that that's a purposeful sampling and sampling on the dependent variable or sampling to see the most effect. So we hypothesized that that's where if we were going to see, engaged scholarship being rewarded, we'd see it in the ASCU schools because of the attachment to place. Kristen? Oh, okay. Was it time check? Good. Okay. These are some of the challenges of him. So let me. Here are the data on the extent to which ASCU schools are overrepresented in engaged scholarship, and we believe because of the 9-year history of Stewards of Place. So, there are 420 ASCU schools. I think it's always hard to figure out how updated the membership list is on the website. But so that's roughly 8, 9, 10%, depending which number you use of how many institutions of higher education there are in the U.S. I was surprised checking this, the disparity between the U.S. Department of Education and UNESCO is something like 1,300 or 1,400. So I don't know what the United Nations counts. But let's just say roughly ASCU campuses, 420 out of 4,300 colleges and universities, so somewhere around 9%. And so in 2008, it was 8.7% were classified of ASCU, and 2010. Now, here are the statistics that are interesting, because while they represent about 10% of all higher ed, they're overrepresented by a factor of 3 in the campuses that were classified. So we said, well, this is where we're going to do the first part of the study. And we've essentially looked at close to a third of the data for each of the 2 years. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is the Stewards of Place, and ASCU is interested in revisiting Stewards of Place as they move toward the 10th anniversary. How well has this succeeded? And we call this Stewards of Place 2 because what can we learn from the Carnegie data that will inform this ongoing commitment to place? So almost 69% of the ASCII schools referred their region in their mission statement. We don't have comparative data for the non-ASCII schools. We'll look at that at some point. But it meant that it was a smaller area. It was part of the mission. And in more recent years, and a lot of institutions, and certainly mine has, we now add the term global for a variety of reasons. But okay, there's the line. We envision engaged citizens of our university and their host communities. And that's really a defining characteristic of the Stewards of Place part of ASCII schools. And so this is a fairly typical mission statement. And again, over 2/3 of the mission statements reference place. There were some common characteristics on the mission statements. And one of the things we talk about in higher ed programs and in conferences like this are the silos in higher education. And so one of the questions that you can look at the Carnegie data, to what extent does engagement cross silos? It's one of those propositions. So we've got a great engaged student service learning program, but do we link that to our community engagement, or is that a different office? Or like in a lot of the land-grant offices, there's the outreach, which involves faculty on land-grant appointments and whatever the extension system, but not so much with students. I remember some years ago I had a meeting between faculty who were doing service learning with students and faculty who were doing community outreach through extension. And it was a collision of two worlds at first. That's changed in a lot of places. And then this integration of teaching, research, and service, that was the model I flipped through quickly because probably the most advanced schools have thought about engagement across all three, not three competing domains, both in practice and how they've conceptualized it. And then a specific research connection to engagement. Here are some of the specifics that were in some of the mission statements: a commitment to economic development, commitment to K-12 schools, and committing community engagement to student retention and success. And some of these may not seem to be very high percentages, but remember, there are a lot of things in most mission statements. So, this is interesting, although some of you know, a lot of my work has been initially around students in service learning. So it's not surprising that the highest percentages of engagement are around student research, student leadership, and integrated into various student programs and projects. And that's not the main focus of the data, but I think it's part of the context. And an interesting question, I suspect, but I don't know, that on many campuses this came first and is the most well-developed piece of engagement. Okay, here's what we found in terms of Reform P&T guidelines. So last night some of us heard Tim Eatman talk about hope and optimism being part of this work. So you could look at this and say, well, that's a quarter, but remember that's a quarter of a third. And unless we're surprised, it's going to be lower in the non-ASCII campuses. But they had claimed to reform policies. We have not, when we use that term, it means we hadn't checked them. We probably won't check these. And the importance of faculty roles overall. And I think this is interesting because not only had they done that, some percentage who had said they reformed them to include the integration across the three faculty roles. And this is interesting. This gets back to the deans, the departments, and the tightrope of how much this is actually embedded in departments. I said I wasn't going to look at the literature on how faculty become engaged, but I think this is an important study. It came out of the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA. Most of us know about filling out the CHIRP studies and the freshman survey and that. And this was a faculty study. And so this asks the question of what determines faculty engaged scholarship. And I would recommend, and there are some other articles around that, but I think this is particularly interesting because it's a large national sample. But here's the finding. Mission matters, institutional support matters. And statistically, I forget how many thousand faculty they had in this study, but over and above individual dispositions of faculty members, and even when you control for disciplinary culture, it's faculty perception that this matters and that the institution supports them in this work. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't. Yeah. Review of Higher Ed, summer 2010. It's also on the Harry website under Vogel Jasang in the publications. Okay, I'm getting time signals. Uh-oh, is that a negative sign? So this afternoon, those of you who want to pursue this, so I'm in deficit mode. Anyway, so to wrap up, there are some lessons learned. They're the ones that, difficulties of assessment, difficulties of reciprocal partnerships, difficulties with faculty rewards, and also then this whole integration and alignment, the silo problem. And these are the slides on what we think will be changed in 2015. Let me just point out one. One of the questions I get is, who has to apply or reapply in 2015? And the answer is, all the campuses in 2006 and 8, which is a number of you raised your hand, will need an abbreviated application process, essentially a progress report, and the 2010 schools won't need to do anything until 2020. And for those of you who are interested, we can do more on that this afternoon. I suspect that Campus Compact and NERCHI will be doing workshops probably starting in 2013 as we did for the 2010 classification. Okay, and there's the link, and then here's how to contact John Saltmarsh. Thank you.